I am sure that at some point in your life you would have come across or at least heard of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. They were poets in the First World War, and their poems are still extremely well known today. We will be exploring the background of these two poets in the context of their poems.
To give a brief history of the First World War, the common feeling of it was that it would be over by Christmas 1914. Young men queued up to join, being caught up in a wave of patriotism which was widespread due to propaganda. However, many of the soldiers' naive outlook was shattered as they experienced the atrocities of war, including trench warfare.
The First World War was the first modern war where newly developed industrial means of destruction, such as tanks, machine guns, and missiles, were used for the first time. Troops were slaughtered in unprecedented numbers.
It was this horrific first-hand experience of war and the wild contrast to the glorious image that the soldiers had of war, which became the basis of many poems by both Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon.
These two poets actually met at a hospital in Edinburgh, where they became very close. This was where Sassoon greatly influenced Owen, who would then write his most prominent poems.
As a young boy, Siegfried Sassoon discovered a love for poetry from Tennyson and Keats, and he wrote romantic verses. Between 1907 and the start of war, he was able to live a comfortable life of writing, playing cricket, and other sporting interests. His private income meant that he didn't have to get a job. He nursed ambitions to play cricket for Kent and become a writer.
He was full of patriotic fervour and enthusiastic about war effort. For example, one of his first poems, Absolution, creates the passion and glory of war, which reflected the common feeling towards war. But his innocence and first-hand experience of trench warfare made his reaction to the horrors and realities of war all the more bitter and violent, and had a huge influence on his poetic outlook. The grim contrast between his privileged, laid-back lifestyle before the war fueled his anger towards war. There were a number of other factors which caused Sassoon's views on war to dramatically change.
He grew disillusioned with the tactics employed in the pursuit of war, in particular trench warfare, in which the combatants fought for disputed territory from the trenches. He witnessed the infamous Battle of the Somme, where more than 1 million men were killed, where soldiers were sent line after line merely to gain some ground. The incompetence of the army chiefs who made these battle plans but were well out of danger also angered Sassoon. This anger inspired many of his poems, including The General and From the Baseline. And were cursing his staff for incompetent swine, and speed glum heroes up to the line of death, are both quotes from these two poems. And his final ironic line, what he did for them both by his plan of attack in The General, epitomizes the lines led by Donkey's idea, which became popular in the military history of the 60s, portraying brave soldiers being sent to an unnecessary death by incompetent leadership.
Furthermore, his encounter with Robert Graves, who was another war poet, whose poetry challenged unthinking attitudes towards the war, helped change Sassoon's views on war. The death of his younger brother Hamill at Gallipoli in November 1915 and good friend David Thomas in March 1916 brought home to Sassoon the full impact of war, completely changing his attitude towards it.
On top of this, the contrast between the serenity of the English countryside, where he was sent for recovery and rest when he was wounded in the hell of the war that he would have to return to, angered him. He got to know how little the people at home understood what the soldiers were suffering abroad, and condemned the hypocrisy of people on the home front who were oblivious to the suffering of the soldiers and continued to support the war. His poem, Glory of Women, angrily mocks the women at home who urge their men to fight. He loathed the way pacifism, which he saw as the worthwhile cause, was spoken of as cowardice, especially by women.
His sense of betrayal by the people at home, and his anger towards the authorities who supported a futile war, as he saw it, knocked out all of the flowery romantic language and grand ideals out of his poetry. And avoiding the sentimentality and jingoism of many war poets, he wrote of the horror and brutality of trench warfare, and contemptuously satirized generals, politicians, and churchmen for their incompetence and blind support of the war.
In July 1917, Sassoon made a public stand against war, in which he made a written statement about his objections to war, which he gave to his commanding officer and refused to return to the front line. In the letter he wrote, "I believe that this war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it." His declaration was condemning the war and the government position was read out in the parliament and caused public outrage.
Sassoon was expected to be taken before a court-martial, but his friend Robert Graves intervened and managed to persuade the review board that he was suffering from shell shock. As a result, Sassoon was sent to Craig Lockhart War Hospital, where he would meet Wilfred Owen. Similar to Sassoon, Wilfred Owen read romantic poets such as Keats and Shelley from a young age. By his upbringing, character, religion, and philosophy, he was unsuited to the role of a soldier. He was shy, bookish, sensitive, caring, and deeply Christian. He had been brought up according to his mother's strong religious beliefs and was a devout believer in his youth. He had even been considering becoming a priest.
However, Owen's sense of guilt and being pressured by propaganda to become a soldier made him enlist in 1915. Nevertheless, like Sassoon and most young men, he was full of boyish high spirits at being a soldier and enjoyed the reaction that he got when he was in his uniform. However, when he was sent to the Western Front, he experienced a violent trench warfare, waded miles along the trenches 3 feet deep in water, experienced gas attacks, and had to sleep out in deep now and intense frost during the winter. On one occasion, he was trapped in a trench under heavy fire for several days with the remains of his fellow officer. Like Sassoon, his romantic ideals for war were shattered. He lost his innocence and he was greatly delusioned.
These horrific experiences of active service on the Western Front led him to getting shell shock on April 1917, or in modern terms, PTSD, and he was sent to Craig Lockhart War Hospital, which specialised in patients with shell shock in Edinburgh, to be treated. This is where he met Siegfried Sassoon.
Owen was in awe of Sassoon's collection, The Old Huntsman, which he read at the hospital, and he greatly admired him. When he met Sassoon later the same month, he even wrote to his mother that he was feeling a very high pitch of emotion. Shakespeare reads vapid after these. Up until meeting Sassoon, Owen was very conflicted. He was against war, but he could not relate to pacifists. But Sassoon completely changed Owen's views on war by convincing him that politicians had secretly changed their aims and were now more interested in grabbing colonies and trade than their original honourable struggle to liberate Belgium.
Owen had been writing verse for about 6 years before the war and learned how to use sound effects with some skill, but lacked a subject that he could feel strongly about. But after meeting Sassoon, finally had a theme that he could write about.
Their first meeting was awkward. Sassoon, 7 years older and already an established poet, patronised the younger man and later referred to Owen's embarrassing grammar school accent. However, after some time, they grew close and Sassoon mentored Owen and helped to draft his poems. During the time they had together, Sassoon encouraged Owen to write more realistically and directly, using a less elaborate, more colloquial style. As a result of his doctor, Arthur Brooke, encouraging Owen to write as part of his treatment in Sassoon's influence. Owen's thoughts and style changed dramatically and wrote some of his most famous poems, Anthem for Doomed Youth and Dulce in Decorum Est, believing, like Wordsworth, a romantic poet whom Owen admired, that poetry arises from emotion recollected in tranquility. Owen sent his mind back to the experiences he had undergone at and near the front early in 1917. The poems that Owen wrote while at hospital included
Anthem for the Doomed Youth, properly written August 1917. This was written from Owen's first tour of duty on the Somme. He writes about how young the soldiers who fought were, and how soldiers were not being properly buried and commemorated. His useful graphic language and direct questioning used by Sassoon was adopted by Owen. For example, what passing bells for these who die as cattle? The shrill, demented cries of wailing shells. This photograph shows the corrections that Sassoon made on Owen's draft for Anthem for Doomed Youth.
Owen originally called the poem Anthem for Bad Youth, but Sassoon changed this to Anthem for Doomed Youth. Dulce in Decorum Est was written in October 1917. It is a denunciation that war results in suffering and death. Owen writes about a gas attack similar to his own experience of an attack in which a fellow soldier went blind. Arguably, the most feared weapon used in the First World War was poison gas, which was first introduced by the Germans in the First World War. Being hit by an artillery shell or machine gun usually resulted in instant or quick death, but the impact of poison gas would be over time and the soldier could suffer for weeks before he finally died. Owen describes a chlorine attack in Dulce in Decorum Est. The gas reacts quickly with water in the airways to form hydrochloric acid, swelling and blocking lung tissue and causing suffocation. We can see Sassoon's influence on Owen from Owen's graphic use of language, the blood gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. The poem has a bitter twist to Horace's ancient line, which was much quoted by jingoistic writers of the time. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country.
Disabled and Mental Cases were both poems based on Owen's experience at Craiglockhart Hospital, when he came across injured soldiers suffering both physically and mentally. In Disabled, Owen wrote, which expresses the tormented thoughts and recollections of a young soldier in World War I who had lost his limbs in battle and was confined and utterly helpless to a wheelchair, which inspires sympathy for his character. It was most likely that Owen was writing from his own experience of being in a hospital and observing men like the one in the poem. The gruesome description of the man's injuries reflects Owen's first-hand experience of such sights and highlights the horror and brutality of war.
A book called Regeneration, written by Pat Barker in 1991, explores these two poets meeting at Craiglockhart Hospital.
It includes Sassoon giving Owen one of his poems to publish in The Hydra, which was the literary magazine produced by patients at Craiglockhart, for which Owen serves as editor. Owen asks Sassoon to read some of his poems and comment on them. Sassoon agrees that he should write about the war because it has been such a personal experience for him. Sassoon thinks that Owen has promise as a poet, but that he should work harder and more diligently on his writing. He agrees to be a mentor for Owen if Owen agrees to publish some of his work in The Hydra.
The book also includes a discussion between Sassoon and Owen about Sassoon's imminent departure when he decides to return to the trenches, feeling guilty about being safe at Craiglockhart Hospital, while others fight in the trenches, by which Owen is deeply affected.
Although Sassoon greatly influenced Owen's work, and the two poets' views on the war and their motivations in writing about it were most likely to be very similar, significant differences appear when one compares their work. Sassoon consistently used a direct style with a regular and exact rhyme, pronounced rhythms, colloquial language, a strongly satiric mode, and he also tended to present men and women in a stereotypical manner.
Owen, on the other hand, although after meeting Sassoon first, wrote several poems in Sassoon's shrilly satirical mode, soon rejected it and created soldier figures who often expressed a fuller humanity and emotional range than those in Sassoon's more cryptic poems. It may have been his compassionate and religious upbringing, which made Owen see beyond hatred for the enemy like most others, including his idol Sassoon.
After staying at Craiglockhart Hospital, both Owen and Sassoon eventually returned to war, but Sassoon was shot in the head and went back to England for good. He recovered from the wound, but the war's mental damage lasted.
He was plagued by nightmares and memories, and a restless sense of futility of war was hard to shake off. He also suffered, as so many survivors of war suffer, from difficulty in personal relationships. He was often deeply lonely. Even 10 years after the war, 65,000 men were still being treated with PTSD and broke down years later. Even after the war, Sassoon continued to express anger towards the authorities for ignoring the suffering of soldiers and not giving them enough recognition in his poem, On Passing New Menin Gate, which he wrote in 1927.
The Menin Gate was built to commemorate the dead, however. The authorities underestimated the number of names of the missing, so another memorial had to be built for more names to be engraved.
Owen, on the other hand, did not survive the war. He was killed just 7 days before the war ended and continued to write poems after leaving Craiglockhart Hospital. One of his last poems, one that he wrote in early 1918 when he was training to return to the front, was called Strange Meeting.
In the poem, he creates a situation where two men see beyond war and hatred to a place where truth and friendship could be established. To assess this place, Owen travels down to a profound dark tunnel, an image where plagued Owen in his childhood and wartime nightmares. This subterranean place is described as hell, where Owen sees a dead soldier who starts to talk to him about his regrets of not being able to live a longer life and the futility of war. In the end, the dead soldier reveals to Owen that he had killed him just the day before, yet he calls Owen a friend and blesses him and forgives Owen, who is his killer.
During a time when everyone, particularly soldiers, despised the enemy, Owen was able to see beyond this hatred and put across the message that all soldiers are just victims of the futility of war. The fact that Owen expresses forgiveness for the enemy and realizes that the soldiers are suffering for nothing, while still actively being a soldier, highlights how ahead of his time Owen was. His view that war was futile and would only make nations trek from progress, and his sense of forgiveness for the enemy was a feeling that was adopted many years after the war. Furthermore, Owen foresees a post-war period with the world changed for the worse by war, and fears that people will accept the shattered world as the norm,
or continue to fight in wars, a frightening and accurate prediction of events.
It was possibly his very religious upbringing which made him compassionate and forgiving and allowed him to see beyond the hatred against the enemy. He wrote to his mother, "I am more and more a Christian, suffer dishonor and disgrace, but never resort to arms. Be bullied, be outraged, be killed, but do not kill." Which was a letter to his mother in May 1917.
Instead of taking on Sassoon's satirical style of writing, Owen simply expresses his longing for the simple truth, for the brutality and futility of war to be reviewed.
Wilfred Owen would not have written the poems which he is now famous for if he had not met Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon, devastated by Owen's death, also made sure that all of his poems were published.
Owen and Sassoon were almost alone in their 1917 opposition to the war. They both helped to shine a light on the atrocities of war and how the British press was lying about the situation and conditions in the trenches.
But in 1918, Owen went further, working at a unique position and writing poems that have no parallel. He was able to look past the patriotic feelings and hatred that people had for the enemy and realize the futility of war.
It was the one thing that he wished people to know. As he stated, all a poet can do today is warn.